Well, I've had a fun time studying this week. I always do, but it was extra interesting just being at camp and trying to squeeze in as much as I could. But also the topic was something that interested me, and it is the judicial system, both in our country and of Israel. So, though not wholly unique in history, going back to the founding of the United States Constitution was an incredible leap forward in the history of the protection of individual rights, the rights of every citizen. And many nations in the years since have modeled their constitutions, their systems of government on ours. At the foundation of our form of government is the principle of the protection from tyranny, from injustice, and the protection by the government of the individual's God-given or inalienable rights. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard those terms before, but it was the intent of the framers of our Constitution, the form of government that we would have, that it would be constructed around the principle of protecting those rights, recognizing that they already existed, recognizing that there is a creator, recognizing that there is a higher power who gives those rights and privileges, not the government itself, which is often the form that other governments take. The idea of the government itself giving to the individuals, giving to the citizens their rights. And so it is the government that becomes the source of identity, the government that becomes the source of rights. Instead, we have that opposite effect in our country. At least that was the original intent, though things are trying to be changed now. This idea of recognizing God, recognizing that higher authority. In fact, at the very core is this recognition of a need for a religious people. John Adams wrote, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." There needs to be that understanding of a higher power. Otherwise, this form of government can't work. And again, as we see our nation crumbling around us, much of that has to do with the lack of this understanding to begin with. Furthering from that principle of protecting the God-given rights of the individual, guaranteed in the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution is that life, liberty, and property cannot be deprived without due process of law. Again, not wholly unique in the world, but something very much a step forward in the protection of individual rights. The government is formed to protect the individual, not to govern him, not to rule him. So the Fifth Amendment and that guarantee means that unless a clearly made law has been broken and the individual has been taken through this prescribed process of prosecution, judgment, and sentencing, then his rights to life, liberty, and property cannot be infringed upon in any way. Early jurists expounded on these two ideologies and created a foundational principle within our criminal justice system. Though the words aren't actually in our Constitution, it is necessary, it is a foundational aspect to our judicial system, and that is the principle of innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. We have in our judicial system the idea that the person accused of a crime is innocent unless proved otherwise. This has not always been the case. In the world, there are many instances of judicial systems that force the accused to prove their own innocence, not the other way around. This means that it falls on the prosecutor. It falls on the witnesses. It falls on those accusing the person of a crime to make it apparent to everyone involved, especially the jurists who would make the judgment, that this individual did commit the crime, that he is accused of, and that beyond any reasonable doubt, he is the one who did it. They must be convinced of that person's guilt. There is no doubt of the defendant's guilt. So, what this means is that our justice system is built to favor the accused. Our justice system is built so that it would be better for a guilty person to go free than an innocent person to be convicted of a crime they didn't commit. This does leave our system of justice open to abuse. But it does so for a very important reason. And this goes all the way back to the beginning. This is why you're getting this judicial history lesson. It goes back to the principle that there is a God. There is a creator. There is a supreme being who will punish the guilty. And it's better to let the guilty go free in this life, knowing they will face his punishment, and that it will be worse for them than it would be for an innocent person to face an unjust verdict. We would rather have the guilty go free for now, because we know they will face God's final justice. Now, this requires that understanding. This requires that kind of belief. And we're seeing changes in our justice system, and we're seeing changes in the attitudes of many people today in our country because that is gone. But that was the original intent. And it is something as Christians we should be appreciative of. Knowing those truths, believing those truths, and allowing it to come out in how we want our government, our man-made, man-run government to work. Now, why this history lesson? Well, I think it's interesting on the one part, but more importantly, our system of justice was built very closely upon the Jewish system of justice. The system of justice that was created out of the Old Testament, specifically given by God to the Jewish people and developed through traditions over the years, but a system that favored the innocent in every way. A system that was created with the principle that the guilty would be punished by God. And it's far better to let an innocent man, or it's far better to let a guilty man go free than to convict an innocent man of a crime he did not commit. Now, the system of Jewish law was centered around the Sanhedrin. And that basically is a Hebrew word transliterated into Greek and then into English that means a gathering, a council. And it started out with regional councils of 23 men who were recognized in the community as being upright, of being morally upright and righteous men, who were not men who could be bribed or could be changed in their verdicts by influence outside of themselves. There was always an odd number so that there would never be an even vote. The councils, the Sanhedrins, acted as both judge and jury. So an accusation would be brought against an individual. They would be brought before this group of elders or leaders, and they would hear the evidence of the case and make a judgment. The Sanhedrin that we most often read about was actually the Great Sanhedrin. That was made up of 70 men, and they met in the temple in Jerusalem. They were essentially the Supreme Court of Israel. If a regional judgment was in question in any way, it would be brought to the Sanhedrin, and a convicted person could bring an appeal to the Great Sanhedrin. It was composed of 70 men who were priests, elders of the people, and scribes, plus the high priest who made 71, thus that odd number, so that they could never come to a tie vote. Now, there were also, in the Old Testament law, multiple guarantees made to a person under prosecution. The first was a guarantee of a public trial. Again, something that was not common in the world of that time. Often, and even since, often trials would be held simply before a king or one of his representatives. And no one could hold that king accountable to their judgments, to their reasoning. But with a public trial laid out before these group of elders, these group of men who would make a decision, no hidden trials could happen. Nothing could happen in secret. Everyone would know the evidence presented, and everyone would know, even if they disagreed with the ruling, why one might come to that conclusion. In this as well was a requirement that the place of the judgment had to be in the open. It had to be a common meeting place. It had to be some place where everyone could gather to hear all of the proceedings. It also had to happen in daylight hours. Nothing could happen in the dark. No testimony could be given, no judgments could be rendered at night. Everything happened in the light of day. The second guarantee was a right to self-defense. One of the members of the Sanhedrin could be called upon by the defendant to be their advocate. Whether they believed them guilty or not, this person would work to the best of their ability to prove the innocence of the accused. The defendant could have this advocate to help them call witnesses for their defense who would participate in their trial, which is part of that right of self-defense. The accused always had the right to present evidence of his innocence, and not always something that is granted. The defendant was also not forced to answer any questions that would incriminate him further, something we have in our own law. His own testimony could not directly convict him if there were not other witnesses involved. You couldn't admit to a crime and be convicted of it unless other people knew of the crime. Third, there had to be witnesses. Deuteronomy 19, in fact, gives some very specific principles as to how this was to happen. In Deuteronomy 19, verse 15, we read, "A single witness shall not rise up against a man on account of any iniquity or any sin which he has committed. On the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses, a matter shall be confirmed." So what that means is that no one can be convicted of a crime unless proven to be guilty by 2 or 3, at least 2 or 3 credible witnesses. This meant that no children could be witnesses, as they'd be too easily swayed. No men of known bad character would be accepted. If you were known to be a liar or a cheat, known to be an immoral person, then no one would allow your testimony. The testimony of slaves would not be allowed because they could be influenced by their master one way or the other. A person, it had to be more than one person because of the he said, she said scenario that would come if it was only the one witness. And so there had to be multiple witnesses with corroborating stories. They had to say the same thing. And the requirements for how the stories had to be exact were quite high. The witnesses had to be eyewitnesses of the event, no hearsay. And they had to identify the person involved. They had to identify the day, even the hour, and the circumstances of the crime. The level of eyewitness testimony was incredibly high. In verses 16 to 19 in that same passage in Deuteronomy, there was a further explanation of the importance of perjury as a very highly punishable offense. It reads, "If a malicious witness rises up against a man to accuse him of wrongdoing, then both the men who have the dispute shall stand before the Lord, both the priests and the judges who will be in office in those days. The judges shall investigate thoroughly, and if the witness is a false witness, and he has accused his brother falsely, then you shall do to him just as he intended to do to his brother. Thus you shall purge the evil from among you." So the penalty for perjury was whatever the penalty would have been for the person if they were convicted of the crime. If you were proved to be a false witness, if it was proved that you were lying just to get this other person in trouble, then you would have the same punishment, the harshest punishment that could be given for that crime. In fact, that's why we have the 9th commandment. The 9th commandment is not, thou shalt not lie. It specifically states, thou shalt not bear false witness. This is the idea of judicial perjury. The whole justice system in Israel was built on this eyewitness system. In death penalty cases, there were further guarantees made to the accused. Special timings for judgments to be rendered. It began with the judgments being given at the end of the trial when all evidence had been presented. It started by taking a tally of all of those who voted to acquit. Initially, the tally was taken only of those in favor of acquittal, and if it reached with the smaller group of the Sanhedrin, 11, the man was acquitted. They needed at least 13 votes to convict in a death penalty case. All of those who were going to vote for guilty had to wait 3 days, or till the 3rd day, in order to cast their vote for guilty. So, after the trial was day 1, the 2nd day had to be spent by all of the judges fasting, which would mean that a trial could not happen in the day before a feast day, a required day of eating and celebrating and thanking God. So that middle day was spent by the judges in fasting and in prayer, considering all of the evidence. And then only on the 3rd day could they be brought back to vote for a final vote. All of those who had voted to acquit on the 1st day were locked in. They couldn't change their vote. Only those who waited until the 3rd day. On this 3rd day, they would begin with the youngest judges, getting their vote because they didn't want them to be influenced by those who were older with more authority to change their vote. And if the accused was convicted, he would immediately be taken from there and executed. There were further guarantees. The first stones to be thrown, the beginning of the execution of the accused had to be done by the witnesses who accused him. In Deuteronomy 17 it says, the hand of the witnesses shall be the first against him to put him to death, and afterward the hand of all the people, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. You see, this wasn't just a public execution to warn. No, the public had to be involved so that everyone knew the crime and the punishment. And everyone was involved at the administration of justice. This meant that the witnesses were doubly set for the death of this man, especially if they were false witnesses. It was making it clear that if you were guilty of lying, if you were guilty of perjury, you were the ones casting the first stones. So not only were you guilty of giving false testimony, now you were guilty of murder as well. Everything was tilted in favor of the accused. The high standards of judgment against the defendants, the requirement of all of these procedures to go through to make sure the certainty that was required in order to convict, especially to convict someone of a crime when the punishment was death. Now, why go through all of this? Again, I think it's interesting. But more than that, it gives us an important picture of the justice system of Israel. The justice system that was in place when Jesus was put on trial. We've been working our way through Matthew. We've been working our way into through the Passion Week over the last several months, and we've come now to chapter 26 and the trial of Jesus. Now this morning we're not actually going to read through the passage, because instead what we're going to do is get an overview picture of all of the Gospels and what happened during the trial of Jesus. And what we will see, even in this overview and then in more detail as we go through each of the stages, as we go through Matthew, is that all of those incredibly high standards of justice, all of those things set to guarantee that an innocent man would not be convicted, were tossed out the window and trampled underfoot. The trial of Jesus was the greatest travesty of justice that has ever happened. Everything was flipped on its head. Everything was wrong. Everything was either abused or completely disregarded. It began with the 3 phases of the Jewish trial, and then moved from there to the 3 phases of the Gentile trial. And we'll look at those in more detail in the weeks to come. But it began with Jesus being taken from the Garden of Gethsemane to Annas, the high priest. Now, Matthew doesn't give us that. In fact, in chapter 26, verse 57, it says, those who had seized Jesus led him away to Caiaphas. Well, Matthew skips the first part where he's taken to Annas. Now, Annas was the high priest, or more specifically, he used to be the high priest. Annas was an incredibly powerful man. He had become the high priest several years before and had amassed such wealth and such power that the Romans deposed him as the high priest. But God's law required that a man, if he became high priest, was high priest for life. So the Jewish people continued to recognize him as the high priest, even though he didn't officially function in that role. He was also what could basically be understood as the head of the temple mafia. Annas was the one who had perfected the system of robbery within the temple walls. It was him who created the system of robbing the people through forcing them to purchase temple animals in order to sacrifice and jacking the price far higher than was necessary. It was him who perfected the system of money changing, making sure that anyone coming into the temple was using only temple money and forcing extreme exchange rates. And through this, amassed a great amount of wealth. Annas held on to power even after being pushed out as the high priest by getting his sons, and he had 5 of them in a row, who served for several years each before the Romans pushed them out. And then eventually his son-in-law, Caiaphas, who was the high priest that year. But Annas was the power behind the throne. In fact, the market that was in the temple was known by the people of Israel as the Bazaar of Annas. It was his marketplace, and all the money was going to him. And he's brought to Annas, and we get a picture of this trial in John chapter 18. And Jesus is brought there with a verdict already set. Jesus is brought there with a punishment known before he even stepped into his house. The verdict was guilty. The punishment was death. And Jesus was brought to Annas so that they could find a crime that would work. You see, there was no crime to begin with. There were no witnesses to bring an accusation against Jesus. There was only a verdict of death that needed the first half of the trial. The crime and the witnesses and all of that, to which there were none. And so we see in John chapter 18, and we'll spend more time looking at it again in the weeks to come, Annas fishing for a crime, trying to get Jesus to convict himself, trying to get Jesus to say something worthy of death. Jesus, of course, never would, as he could never commit a crime, let alone sin. After Annas becomes frustrated and can't find anything to convict Jesus of, he just sends him along to Caiaphas. And this second phase of the Jewish trial happens at night. Again, a direct and blatant travesty of justice, going against everything within the Jewish system. Not only was it at his house, but it was at night. Beyond that, all of the witnesses were bribed. And it was clear from Old Testament law that money could never change hands when justice was being administered. No one could receive any form of payment And yet we have bribed false witnesses. But even in that case, as we'll see, they couldn't come up with anything. They tried to make things stick, but nobody could agree on anything. And finally, two men come with something of a similar statement, trying to say that Jesus was going to destroy the temple and then rebuild it without hands. But as Mark tells us in Mark 14, not even in this respect was their testimony consistent. Even when the two bride witnesses got together, they couldn't get their stories straight. Finally, they simply accused Jesus of blasphemy when he admitted the truth, when he admitted that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And with that, they had their crime. They just had to make everything legal. So they waited until first light. And as soon as the sun crept over the hills, all of the Sanhedrin, being present, condemned him immediately. No witnesses brought. No allowance for a defense. Simple conviction. No waiting for the 3 days. No fasting, no praying, no considering, just a verdict of death. Well, the Jews didn't have the right to kill anyone. Roman law allowed them to govern the day-to-day events of the people of Israel, but not capital punishment. And so the Jews had to take him from there to Pilate. And we have the 3 phases of the Gentile trial. Jesus is taken from there to Pilate and laid out before Pilate as essentially an insurrectionist. They accuse him of gathering people together, of whipping them up into a fervor. The idea being that they're claiming Jesus is trying to start another insurrection. And this would not have been the first, even in the years of Jesus' ministry. They're trying to convince Pilate that this man is going to start an insurrection, and so they want him put to death so that there aren't any problems. Pilate questions Jesus, as he should, and comes to realize that Jesus has no intent. Jesus is not going to start some sort of insurrection. He's not going to cause any problems for Rome, and so Pilate says, no, this isn't my problem. And then he learns that he's a Galilean, and so sends him to Herod, who was the Gentile in charge of Galilee. And we've met Herod before. Herod had wanted to meet Jesus for a long time. He was in Jerusalem for the Passover festivities, and so it was just a quick walk down the road to his area in the temple. And Herod tries to get something out of Jesus and basically just gets frustrated with not getting what he wants, and so sends him back to Pilate. And so we have the 3rd phase of Jesus' Gentile trial, where Pilate tries to appease the Jews by having Jesus scourged. Then he tries to appease the Jews by letting out a criminal, an insurrectionist. And instead of Jesus, who was not an insurrectionist, who was not a problem in any way, shape, or form for Rome, he releases Barabbas, a man who had started an insurrection, a man who was a murderer and a thief, a direct enemy of Rome, and one who would cause these kinds of problems for the Sanhedrin, but no, they want him instead of Jesus. And so finally, to appease the Jews, who kept calling for Jesus' death, Pilate washes his hands and sends Jesus out to be crucified. From start to finish, all of this, a travesty of justice. Flying in the face of everything God had established for his people. Declared guilty when they didn't even have a crime to accuse him of. Sentenced to death before a single witness was brought. And when witnesses do come, they are bribed false witnesses. Never allowed to defend himself. Tried at night, hidden from the crowds. And then the cowardice. The cowardice of the Sanhedrin. There is no way that all 70 of those men believed him guilty. In fact, we know that to be the case. Joseph of Arimathea was one of the Sanhedrin and refused to be a part of this travesty. There were others we know who believed Jesus and yet either remained silent or went along with the crowd. None of them spoke out against this. The cowardice of Pilate and Herod. Both of them knew who Jesus was. They had heard of what he was doing and what he was capable of. Both of them recognized his innocence and yet gave in to this bloodlust. Refused to protect an innocent man. Throughout the night of trials, Jesus constantly was mocked, beaten, spit upon, blasphemed. That was his crime that he was guilty of, blasphemy. Guilty because he was the Son of God. And yet it wasn't his blasphemy that was clear, it was the blasphemy of the people of Israel. Pictured in the Sanhedrin, but all of Israel calling for his blood. Now I want to tie this with another kind of blasphemy. A spitting in the face of Jesus that many are guilty of today. And that is how we deal with the sin of others. You see, the justice system God presents man as one that begins with a presumption of innocence. Innocence until proved guilty by multiple witnesses. Innocence until proved guilty by considered, wise, thought out systems. Never a quick action, never a reaction, never mob justice, and yet so often we ascribe motives without ever learning the truth. We condemn as guilty those around us without evidence ever being obtained or presented, without ever allowing them to defend themselves. You see, in Christian justice, we always should begin with the assumption of innocence. And this is true whether we are dealing with a brother sinning against us or dealing with the people around us, the world around us, even those in sin. This is the core of a heart of forgiveness, a heart driven with the forgiveness of Christ, a heart driven by love. In 1 Corinthians 13, we have the famous passage from Paul describing love. Often read at things like weddings, Paul is actually talking about the love we are to have for one another, and he concludes it with this idea: love bears all things. Love believes all things. Love hopes all things. Love endures all things. You see, it means that we approach anybody who has sinned or sinned against us, giving them the benefit of the doubt. It means that we approach them hoping, we approach them with a desire to be proven wrong in our understanding of what's going on, whether this sin was against you or not. I believe strongly in the adage, never attribute to malice what can be attributed to carelessness. Even when a careless word or action does come against us, even when we are sinned against, it doesn't mean that it's not wrong, but it does mean that maybe it's not quite as bad as we first thought. And we should never assume someone's motive. Always look for the truth, the level of guilt, and look to restore. In Galatians chapter 6, we're told, "Brethren, even if anyone is caught in any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore such a one in a spirit of gentleness. Each one looking to yourself so that you will not be tempted." The idea being that even when someone sins against you, whether it's against you or just in general, you approach them with a spirit of gentleness. That idea of a spirit of gentleness means a spirit of wisdom, discernment, a spirit of patience, a spirit of humility. Each one looking to yourself so that you will not be tempted. Tempted to sin in the same way? Possibly. But as we look to Jesus' description in the Sermon on the Mount of how we confront sin, we look to ourselves. We look to the plank in our own eye. Make sure that we are not coming to them in a wrong attitude. Make sure that we are not coming to them looking for a sentence to be carried out, hoping that they're as guilty as we think they are, but the opposite. We start recognizing our own sin, recognizing our own fallibility, making sure there is not anything obstructing our vision before we then, as Jesus says, then take the splinter out of our brother's eye. We have the same picture of this system of justice in what we call church discipline. As we looked back, at this point a couple of years ago, in Matthew chapter 18, the system of confronting sin within the church. It begins with a single witness. If your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private, and if he listens to you, you have won your brother. Hopefully there's no need for real confrontation. There's no need for a furtherment of this. There's no need for a trial. If he sins, whether it's against you or in general, just go to him in private. There's no need to drag this out before the courts. There's no need to call all of the witnesses and bring in the Sanhedrin to declare guilt or innocence. Look for restoration. Desire restoration. Go in with a heart of forgiveness, hoping for the best outcome. If that doesn't work, then you begin to further it. Then you bring an accusation of a crime. And how does that happen? It happens only when you have 2 or 3 witnesses. But if he does not listen to you, take 1 or 2 more with you, so that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every fact may be confirmed. That's taken directly from Deuteronomy chapter 19. That is the principle of God's justice being applied. Why is that necessary? As we're confronting sin, it helps the individual to see maybe this isn't just one person. Maybe this isn't just you who's seeing this in me. Maybe it's not just you that thinks I sinned here, and it calls them to a greater level of self-examination. But it also brings 2 or 3 people together to come together in prayer, to come together holding one another accountable, holding the one who has sinned accountable to his sin, but also the others to their need for humility and love and forgiveness. Only then is it brought before the court of the church. And remember, the word church there is the word ecclesia, which means a gathering. As we have further developed an understanding of this through the rest of the New Testament, this is brought before the elders of the church, those who God has appointed as the leaders within that assembly, so that they may have a full investigation, to hear the witnesses, to allow the defendant a self-defense, and to work with him, not casting him out immediately, but desiring to see restoration. And there should be deliberation before finally, if necessary, casting them out. All of this is built on God's system of justice. It's better to let the guilty man go free than to convict an innocent man. Why? because we trust in God's justice. We trust that God will bring the truth to light, either in this life or the next. And when we convict our brother of a sin he hasn't committed, when we stand in judgment over him before we know all of the facts, we seek our own justice. We spit in the face of Jesus, his forgiveness, his love, his mercy. We should always err on the side of love and forgiveness because of our fallible nature, and leave the final justice to God, who sees all, who knows the heart of man. But we do seek justice. We do seek restoration to the best of our ability and in humility, looking to God and trusting in his final plans. Just remember, next time you accuse someone, be careful you don't go in as the Sanhedrin did with Jesus, looking for a guilty verdict before you truly understand the crime that they're accused of. Let's pray.